Following on Law Weekly today, a discussion on the effects of contracts that would be breached owing to the disruptive nature of the coronavirus pandemic. We talk with the former chairman of the Nigerian Bar Association's section on business law, George Etomi. We also monitored some courts across the country to see if they had complied with the directive to avoid large gatherings and maintain social distancing. Plus our recap of the top legal stories in the news. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Shola Shuyeli. The cases of COVID-19 continues to rise in the country, with the resultant effects being the shutting down of schools, offices, airports, and even the courts. But what will happen to the contracts across all sectors of the economy that will be breached as a result of this disruptive virus? Can they plead force majeure? Who bears the loss, and what can parties do while we all sit out this pandemic? This was the first question I put to my guest, Mr. George Etomi.
I think the starting point would be to join you and everybody else in channels to send our good wishes to our viewers and our solidarity with everybody at this time, a very difficult time for everyone. Not only has this pandemic been so disruptive of people's personal lives, but like you correctly noted, it's going to present a huge legal challenge in almost all spheres of our lives post the pandemic, because this is not the first time it would have happened, although it's coming like centuries apart. When the Spanish flu took place, and when other known epidemics such as SARS, MERS, and all that happened, we saw that litigation survived so many years after, trying to deal with all the issues that have come. Now, the first major challenge would be the fate of contracts that are affected by this disease. And usually there is a clause in contracts, usually called the force majeure clause, that can be invoked to protect any affected party. And force majeure, just like the name suggests, is a major force. It's something so overwhelming. And the test is usually very objective. It's something none of the contractual parties foresaw. They couldn't avoid, and then it is preventing them from performing their own ends of the contract. Once those three elements are there, then you can rightly say that I want to invoke force majeure. But to invoke force majeure...
Who invokes force majeure? The party in breach?
The party that's affected. Okay. I mean, yes, that's likely to breach and all that. That's the party that invokes it. But force majeure, usually, like I said, is provided for in contracts. So people must generally be careful. It's a bit late now for those who haven't provided it, but those who are going into contracts now should ensure that they make specific provisions for force majeure clause. And force majeure clauses usually are found in boilerplate provisions. But I always advise that we should pay attention to it, because not all events, such as we described, may qualify as force majeure events. So you must specifically provide for things like illness, plagues, riots, earthquake, stuff like that. You must specifically provide for them. If you are silent on them, then it will be assumed that you are willing to take on that risk. So that being the case, let's bring it down home. One of the first things that would be on the table are employment contracts, because right now it's going to be tricky where employers will find money to pay employees. Now, employees have not abandoned their duty posts. There's a Lagos state, for example, where we live, that says everybody stay home. So stay and work from home. For how long can this be sustained before the employers cut off the salaries? And then what then happens to these employees? Employers themselves are probably also dependent on a value chain that's going to snuff their income routes, because they make the income to pay you. What happens to them? So you are looking at supply chain contracts that can create huge challenges to in this period. Now, government action is another one, because a consequence of a virus that's pervading like this is that the global standard is everybody stay home. Everybody, there's almost a global lockdown and all that. That of its own, government action, change of law, change of circumstance, is an event of force majeure, even if it is caused by the pandemic. So you're just looking at causal relationships. So again, government action. I know many lawyers would argue that before we begin to rely on government action, shouldn't a state of emergency have been declared?
Yeah, which is the argument. Some have even gone to court to say that this should have been the first step, as we've seen in other countries.
Yes, clearly. I mean, when we saw the South African president on television, Ghana, even the US and co, declare that. That hasn't happened in our own case. But I just don't want us at this point to be legalistic. The circumstances are clear. Whether or not somebody comes to formally tell us that this is a state of emergency, we're all at home. We are all in danger of losing our lives if this pandemic hits us at the wrong end. We don't really need to wait for a special declaration. There should have been, don't get me wrong, but we just need to act as though one had been done. And what does a state of emergency really portend? It basically suspends the rights of citizens. So, and that's what we're already saying. Don't go out, don't play here, don't go to the market, don't. You will find that all over the place. And it's my advice.
This is what is already happening.
And that's my advice. If you see a moving train coming, don't say because the rule says there must be an alarm. You see it, get out of the way, which is what I think we should be doing. So coming back to the subject of force majeure. So the question then becomes, so what then happens? I can give you some very practical examples. Let's even start with our politicians. There is a time within which you should appeal a conduct, and 90 days within which you bring a case and blah, blah. The courts are shut down now. What then happens? So
the time limits, stipulated time limits.
What then happens? Does the time erase and then starts counting after the pandemic? Or is it just caught up and it's caught up and good luck to whoever the beneficiary is?
There's nothing that can be
and all
done.
That. Many, I don't have the answers, and that's why I said I just foresee a flurry of actions. Let's look at the supply contract. Somebody is planning to celebrate a happy event, 70th birthday. It's paid for everything, giving money to event planner, and boom, you can't go out. He then says, okay, please, something, give me part of my money back. Event planner says, look, I am also committed to people who have supplied me, blah, blah, blah. I don't have any money to return to you. It is unlikely that the celebrant will get everything back, but to get nothing at all, it's an issue. Again, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, so who bears the loss?
Exactly. So what we've seen in many instances, the courts themselves, those that have found their way to the courts, have actually looked to, some have actually rewritten the contracts because they weigh the circumstance. For example, if a force majeure event occurs, before you can take advantage of it, you must be seen to have done your own bit to mitigate the effect on you. If you don't, only because you want to rely on it to avoid an obligation, you may be hard put to ask the court to support you.
So you must be seen to have signed it as part of the contract before you can rely on it.
Yes, you should generally. That's what we say. But if you don't, you will be hard pressed to say that you didn't know that that was a calculated risk that you took. And then besides, for force majeure as well, you must, as I said, apart from mitigating the damage to you, some force majeure requires that you give notice. So the moment the event that nobody foresaw and nobody could avoid, and which is now preventing you from performing your contract, of course, you must notify the counterparty.
Even if it's common knowledge?
Yes, you must notify. If your contract says notify, then notify them at the earliest possible opportunity. Because if you were already in breach of a contract, the mere fact that a force majeure event has occurred you cannot benefit from it. If you are paying back a bank loan that was already due, you cannot take benefit of it. You are owing. If the task only becomes more difficult for you to do, it's not or less profitable, you cannot take advantage of force majeure. So all these are delicate things that will be balanced, and that's why I say there will be lots and lots of litigations and arbitrations about who can benefit, or when a force majeure becomes effective for a counterparty to take advantage of.
You've advised on force majeure, but what if you haven't signed a contract that specifically takes this into consideration? What would happen?
In fact, there are other remedies. The one that comes immediately to mind is the doctrine of frustration. Just like the word suggests, when some overwhelming event occurs that impedes your ability to perform on the contract, you can invoke that doctrine. And that principle has been upheld in common law jurisdictions, including Nigeria, to be valid to relieve a party of their obligations because the supervening event has made it absolutely impossible for them to meet with their contractual obligations. The contract then gets terminated, and that's the chief difference between that and force majeure. In the case of force majeure, you actually suspend the obligations. I'm sure if you remember when we had the famous Niger Delta crisis, Shell and all these other major oil companies used to declare force majeure because they were expected to produce a certain quantity of crude oil for sale. Otherwise, they would have penalties to pay. Now, when this sort of militant actions occur, they are then obliged to notify NNPC, who is their contracting partner, to say on account of XYZ, we can't meet with the obligation. So that obligation is suspended until the event, which means they avoid the penalty to be paid. But in the case of frustration, you can actually lead to in fact, once it's declared, it means the contract essentially has been terminated. And once it's terminated, it's a totally different ball game. You then begin to look at the effects of a termination of a contract. Obligations on both sides cease. And then things that have happened before, you can then decide what happens to those things.
What will your general advice be to government? Because we've seen some governments issuing out stimulus packages.
Many of them have seen the effect, what we're talking about, going to happen. So there are stimulus packages being prepared globally. Hopefully it will last. Those packages will last and assuage affected people until this pandemic is over. But one of the harrowing prospects could be, for how long? What if this pandemic, and for how long can government pay employees to stay at home, which is really what the issue would become. In Nigeria, the CBN has issued a moratorium on corporate loans. That's part of its own response to the COVID-19. Because it's going to hit so many people. People are just, life will not be the same for so many people.
Can everybody benefit from that?
No, mainly those who have given corporate loans. There is, remember the National Assembly is also passing a bill, to alleviate the problems for the citizenry generally. And they're thinking about waiver of interest on loans. They're thinking about, in some states, I've been saying, look, suspend payment of rents by tenants. So if you are suspending rent by tenants, it means the landlord has to be compensated in one form or the other. They're looking at how do you ease transportation concerns, because people still need to go out to get essential things, because that's what's going to protect the ordinary citizen and all that. So in other words, what you're doing is you are suspending rights. You're actually suspending rights. And this is really what a force majeure is. You are suspending people's rights until such a time as the event blows over, then you resume. But what you then do is you look at the damage. What damage has been done and how do we ease the effect? Because it's going to affect everybody. I mean, a landlord is somebody too. He depends on his rent. The tenant depends on his salary. Salary, you know, so it's a chain. It's a supply chain. That's why I said that when it all blows over and all that, there must be some element of give and take so that we can quickly reset the economic bottom.